And welcome back to Mostly Movies, where we mostly discuss movies, mostly. Tonight we're going to start with Doctor Strange, which I had just seen recently in theaters, and offer some thoughts about recent films, a classic film, and a few movies that are on streaming right now. So let's start with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Well, Sam Raimi's back, making movies again. The Godfather of the modern comic book movies comes back with startling and shocking results. It throws a monkey wrench into the Marvel universe, yes, but that is quite frankly a universe that needed some monkey wrenching to keep things interesting. Because honestly, after Endgame, it was starting to lose me a little bit. I know Spider Man No Way Home got a lot of accolades, and there were amazing moments in it. But there's a lot of logical questions that I felt the film never really answered. So I felt like Doctor Strange is basically doing a similar story, but in a much more interesting way. And I like that turning a character who's a beloved character, especially after getting a wonderful spin off show, to the dark side, going full Anakin here, was a big risk. That was something I would expect from DC Comics. Um, but it's a step in the right direction for Marvel because while I enjoy the MCU overall, a lot of their films play it safe. I give Disney a lot of credit for letting Sam Raimi have full reign on one of their properties. And I'm starting to suspect that he might be the director that they're grooming for the Fantastic Four now that the director of the Spider Man movies has moved on to a Star Wars series and has walked away from the project. And I don't think we've seen the last of Wanda. So I like the humor of this film. I like the darkness. It's definitely a big Army of Darkness vibe because I have a theory about Sam Raimi that he basically has been trying to, one way or another, make the Evil Dead trilogy in a lot of the other movies that he's made since. Um, in terms of the slapsticky humor and those elements. Even like there was even touches in Oz the Great and Powerful that felt like references to Army of Darkness, but it was just through the lens of the Wizard of Oz. So big metal horns up for Doctor Strange, and it's great to have Sam Raimi directing movies. I did like his TV work on Ash versus the Evil Dead, but it's nice to see him making theatrical films once again because it's been a very very long time since he's done that. So, as for recent reviews, we'll start with The Batman, which I was very busy with schoolwork, so I didn't do a review after seeing the film in theaters. Okay, the film is way too long. There is a little bit of the woke stink in a couple of scenes, like, the idea of like white privilege and all these other things that get introduced is not something I really want to hear about in a Batman movie or a detective movie. I'm not interested in the politics of the day, the social politics, the politics. All that stuff is boring to me and has really no place in Batman, which should just be basically a crime story and a detective story. But I do admire the film overall in its scope and vision. The last hour is very impressive. But again, it takes a long time to get there. I was not really crazy about the Riddler. I loved his plotting and I loved the plan, but the whole S&M Zodiac vibe was something I would have changed. And my good friend John Matthews mentioned that his voice sounds very just it's just not the Riddler. But I'm looking forward to Batman 2. Please, Lord, let it be shorter. Big metal horns up for the Batman. Okay, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022, because they don't give it even titles anymore or subtitles or call it number three or call it number four or call it number five. It just is called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just like Halloween in 2018 is called Halloween, which makes no sense because Halloween came out in 1978 and this movie is a direct sequel to that film, but it's called Halloween. It's like making Star Wars and then 3 years later comes, instead of The Empire Strikes Back, it's just called Star Wars. It's weird. This movie is awful. The bus scene is great. but not that great because then you stop and think, oh, they just ripped off the scene from Rogue One where Darth Vader lets loose, basically. But instead of Darth Vader, it's Leatherface. So once you realize that, even that great scene is not so great anymore when you realize it's aped from another movie. This whole movie is aped from other movies, like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and much better films. It was trying to catch on to the Dave Gordon Green Halloween cred, but it failed miserably. And like the Alien franchise, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre hasn't had a good film since 1986. Metal Horns down. Lastly, in recent releases, I would have to say Jackass Forever is a crude, inhumane, and downright disturbing at times, but it is also probably the most I've laughed in a movie theater in years. This movie is hilarious. Uh, it's gross, it's disgusting. It's definitely not for the squeamish. I don't think most people will like it. And it's not usually my cup of tea, this type of humor. But this particular film is just very, very funny to me. Again, don't leave the kids at home. Guys, I'd probably say leave the wives at home. But it is really funny. Metal horns up. Now we're going to talk about From the Vault. This is a new segment. We're going to talk about the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Uh, From the Vault is where we discuss physical media, where it thrives and survives. And Close Encounters is a movie that I picked because I just heard a recent podcast talking about it. And it's one of those films that I don't think gets enough talk or enough credit. It's one of Spielberg's earlier masterworks, right after he did Jaws. My first viewing was on video disc, CED video disc, in the early 80s, and it was the special edition version from 1980, which is similar to the theatrical film, but some of the dramatic scenes are put back in that were cut for time. But Spielberg wanted to re-release the film in theaters, and Columbia said, well, unless you can give us a fancy ending where we see the inside of the ship. And this is before E.T., so Spielberg wasn't really going to fight them on it. He says, fine, I'll do that if I can have it re-released in theaters. So I had seen parts of the special edition growing up, but again, unfortunately, it's a very boring film. When you're a kid, I was just a kid, and I thought it would be like, I want to watch Star Wars again or something. And Close Encounters is not quite that. And then, of course, I didn't see it fully until late 90s, I would say. I bought the widescreen tape in the late 90s, and it was the 1990s director's cut that Spielberg had done, which was basically the special edition without the fancy ending. Now, why is this film so overlooked? Why do people not really talk about it? Well, here's the thing. It's the follow-up to Jaws, but it's not Jaws. It came out the same year as Star Wars, but it's not Star Wars. Also, that special edition came out in 80, which is the same film with a fancy ending. Um, and it's kind of needless. We don't really need to see that. And then it was, do you like the theatrical? Do you like the special edition? And then, Spielberg couldn't really argue with the studio with that new special edition ending because at this time, he was still kind of wounded from the disaster of the film 1941. And you're only as good as your last movie. I'll say it again. Any filmmaker, you're only as good as your last movie. He had done Jaws, he had done Close Encounters, but 1941 was a disaster. And a lot of the studios were not that interested in the next Steven Spielberg movie suddenly. As a matter of fact, when George Lucas and Spielberg were shopping around Raiders of the Lost Ark, Fox turned it down, which was odd because Empire Strikes Back was such a hit. And I believe Columbia might have turned it down as well, or Universal might have turned it down. And it wasn't until Paramount said, yeah, we want to make Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then the film came out, and of course it was a big success. But a lot of people doubted that film, believe it or not, because it's hard to see the film in the script stage. Now, we'll talk more about director's cuts when we do a Blade Runner video. And sometimes The problem with director's cuts or alternate cuts is that it can confuse the memory of a film. Even if the film is liked, people will be like, well, which version and which one should I watch and all that kind of stuff. Like, I talk to people all the time that want to start on Lord of the Rings, and should they start with the theatricals or start with the special editions? And in my opinion of Lord of the Rings, at least, is start with the theatricals. And if you like them, the special editions are, in my opinion, better films. They're deeper and they're richer. Uh, but I always believe that both versions should be available, especially when it comes to something like Star Wars or, other films. Well, what hurts the film or adds to the obscurity, um, for the most part, isn't the director's cut. It's that 5 years later, Spielberg makes E.T., which also deals with alien contact in a more personal way than Close Encounters. Also, one of the big problems in Close Encounters is it's about a father who leaves his family, while E.T. is about children that are left behind. So there's much more sympathy there. Now, part of the reason why we sympathize with Roy Neary, the hero of Close Encounters, is that in many ways he's like a child himself. Even though he's married and has three children, he basically is like a child. So that's why we don't think, well, this guy's a jerk. He's just leaving his family behind. But we still can enjoy the film to this day, and I think it's great. If you see it in a theater, you usually won't see the theatrical one. They usually just show the special edition, the last director's cut from the 90s, which is definitely great and definitely worth seeing. However, I watched all three versions for this video of Close Encounters, and a special edition I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Out of all three of them, believe it or not, I had seen the theatrical cut for the first time. I had never seen it before, and I actually thought that that one was the best. There are some good dramatic scenes that are omitted, but for some reason the film worked better, in my opinion. And I think that that first cut of the film is the best version. So if you get the Blu-ray or the fancy 4K, I would say definitely see the theatrical version because that's the one to go for. Okay. Now, our last segment is called Cross the Streams. This is where I talk about two or three movies that are currently on streaming and my thoughts about them. Again, completely random, just films that I just bumped into or just started watching. There was no precedence for anything. It's just what I was in the mood to watch. Because I don't really like the ideas of queues or I have a big list of 500 movies or 600 movies. The problem with that is that you never end up going through the queue that way. So we'll start with Showboat from 1936, which is on HBO Max, directed by James Whale. I'd seen the 50s adaptation growing up, but I had heard that the original was definitely worth seeing. Not only is it worth seeing, it is much superior to the 1950s counterpart. Brilliantly directed by James Whale. Yes, the same James Whale that directed Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man. He perfectly captures the spirit of the show, and unlike most classical music adaptations, it is highly cinematic. If you're a fan of classic cinema, and especially musicals, this is a must-watch. Next, on Netflix, we have Top Gun from 1986, directed by Tony Scott. It's leaving Netflix soon. It'll probably end up on Paramount Plus. I haven't seen this one in years. I remember seeing it in the theater as a kid and being pretty bored, except for the flying scenes, because when you're six, you're not really going to understand what's going on in this film. And I'd see bits and pieces of it, but this is probably the first time I sat down to watch it in 35 years or so to prep for the new film, which I am anticipating a little bit. The flying scenes are still cool, but I didn't really care for this film, sadly. It is nice to look at. The soundtrack is okay, but overall it feels kind of hollow. It's one of those films that is considered a classic by lots of people, but I just wasn't feeling it. There are some good moments, and the boys are pretty to look at, but there really isn't much more to this film. And I'm going to get some hate for that, definitely. And lastly, if there's one great film on streaming now, it's actually a documentary on Shudder called Memory. which is about the making of Alien. It's directed by Alexandre O'Fleet. And this isn't a run of the mill, puff piece documentary about a classic movie. This is a brilliant examination of a film that isn't quite forgotten, but is a little bit more obscure than it should be. Part of that has to do with sequels, but to run through the Alien sequels is a whole other video. The brilliance of this film is the great story by Dan O'Bannon, creature designs by Swiss artist H.R. Giger, and the brilliant direction of Ridley Scott. Scott once said the inspiration for this film was 2001: A Space Odyssey, Star Wars, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film gives us that cold, quiet reality of space, the down-to-earth humanity of Star Wars, and the sheer unimaginable terror of Texas Chainsaw. So this documentary, I think, is definitely a must-see for Alien fans. Certainly, it's better than anything on the anthology set, which I've gone through that whole set, which is amazing. And if you're a fan of cinema in general, I would say watch Alien first. There's a great, great release that came out a few years ago on 4K before Disney was taken over by the mouse. And they were making some of the best retro releases. And now, unfortunately, the best way to get classic releases is if you go through companies like Arrow, Kino, Imprint, Indicator, and a couple of other ones. Unfortunately, it's a lot more expensive. But that's probably the best way to get retro releases these days, because the major studios really don't care about restoring the classics. I mean, they'll put them on their streamers, but I feel like there's something lost in that there are certain movies that it's always good to have physical copies of these things. So once again, with Memory, it's the one of the best, not just one of the best, documentaries about, Alien or these type of film, but I think it's just one of the best films, the best documentary films made about the production and the psychology of this film. That this film is actually working on a much deeper level than people realize. Alien is a much deeper and a much richer film than people realize, and I just wish that it had a chance to be considered the great film that some of us consider it to be. Because the problem was, it wasn't even 10 years old by the time there was a second one. And the second one is great, don't get me wrong. It's an amazing movie. But it took took Alien a very, very different direction um, than what Scott and the other directors had to do. And then the later sequels get pretty bad. 3 is bad. 4 is better than 3, but it's not good. Um, it has its entertaining moments, but it's really not that great either. All the mystery and all the depth and the psychology of the first film, and even in the second film, is completely lost in those two films, even though Alien 3 and 4 have their fans. And I kind of do have a little bit of a soft spot for Alien Resurrection, but it's not a tenth of the first two films. And then Prometheus, I think, was trying too hard, and it was a little bit too precious. And I said I wasn't going to talk about the Alien sequels, and here I am. But it was a little too precious, and it was a little too. It was like the first church of Alien, basically. It was just worshiping the first film instead of just taking what the first film did and running with it. It was just kind of a big, fanboy geek out over the original Alien. And they got some of the major details wrong. Like, how can you be this obsessed with the original film and then miss out on the big details? That didn't seem to make any sense. But still, overall, Prometheus is a pretty good movie. And then Alien Covenant is unfortunately the worst of the Alien movies. That's when Ridley Scott himself, who created this entire world with the great help of Dan O'Bannon, H.R. Giger, and the wonderful production designers and art, storyboard artists and things, he made a film that basically was the opposite of Prometheus, which was not precious and was not caring about the alien story, and it was just a completely, just a horrific experience. I remember seeing it in the theaters, and I was on board for about the first half hour, and I'm like, this is going to be so great. And then it just takes a dive, and it just gets worse and worse and worse, and literally ends with me like yelling at the screen for how ridiculous and awful it was. And the few people that were sitting next to me said, honestly, we were going to leave, but we were just so entertained by your reactions to the movie that's what we got our money's worth at. We weren't even watching the screen. We would just watch every few minutes something would happen to piss you off. And we had to stay and watch your reactions. And I says, well, I'm glad I could, somehow entertain you in this theater because this movie's certainly not doing anything for any of us. So please watch the first Alien and watch Memory. If you like horror movies, if you like the darker side of the sci-fi genre, if you're not into horror movies, don't watch Alien. Um, not one for everybody, but I think it's pretty great. So we're going to do some more of these videos. Again, Top Gun. I might be reviewing that one. I'm also going to talk about a few other recent releases on streaming in the next few weeks. So, watch the skies. This is Dan Siri, Last Survivor of the Nostromo, signing off.